Hi, everyone. My name is Derek Brett. I'm Director of Education here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And thank you as well to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting our lecture series this year. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Erie Canal. Erie Canal Museum itself is located on the homelands of the Onondaga Nation, Central Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That the Erie Canal is located on the homelands of all the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. We recognize the Erie Canal played a major role in the devastation of their traditional ways of living, negative effects of which still linger to this day. Here at the Canal Museum, we are committed to taking action as best we can in addressing these wrongs through education and inclusion, including through efforts like our partnership with the Scano Great Law Peace Center, reinterpretation of our exhibits and public programs, offering important first steps in that process. Now, the impact of the Erie Canal has been transformative in a number of ways. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, our mission is to engage the public in the story of the Erie Canal's transformative impacts on peoples and places in the past, present, and future. One area where we can see this transformative role is in the development of religions, as we'll soon learn about. This lecture is part of our bicentennial Sloan lecture series. We have some really great ones planned for the rest of the year in addition to this one. I highly recommend signing up for an annual pass. You won't miss any of our speakers and automatically be registered for all of our talks and get a recording of them afterwards. So, our next talk is on July 30th, when longtime Erie Canal scholar Duncan Hay will discuss the engineering behind the modern barge canal system. Additionally, our annual Beers, Bikes, and Barges cycling series has gotten underway with rides across the state throughout the summer, where you can ride your bike, learn some canal history, and end with a refreshing beverage of your choice. Our ride tonight in Oneida has been postponed due to weather, unfortunately, to August 28th. Our next ride is July 24th, right here in Syracuse. You can learn more at eriecanalmuseum.org. You can also find out more regarding our weekly walking tours, which cover topics like abolition, women's rights, fire, and architecture. Also, another special event coming up is July 22nd will be the building you are all sitting in right now, the Syracuse Waylock Building's 175th birthday. So we hope you can join us for a little birthday party for the building. There will be cake. And one of the big highlights, the music box over in the corner will be played. That I think 150-year-old music box donated to us by John Marcellus, the great local philanthropist and casket maker. Anywho, yes, who also just recently passed away, unfortunately. So this will be a good way to honor him as well. There's a whole lot more going on this year, but only so much time. So I'll just say subscribe to our e-newsletter at the bottom of our website to get updates on everything that's going on here and for the bicentennial. But now on to the main event. SB Rodríguez-Plate is a writer, speaker, editor, and professor whose books include A History of Religion in 5.5 Objects and Blasphemy, Art That Offends. Their essays have been published in Newsweek, Slate, The Christian Century, the Islamic Monthly, the Huffington Post, and elsewhere. They are executive director of April, editor of the journal CrossCurrents, and professor by special appointment at Hamilton College in New York. So let's give a big hand to SB. All right.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here at the museum. I've been here several times with students. I teach courses in religion and ... all kinds of ends to my religion. Religion and media, religion and film, religion in upstate New York is one of my favorites. I grew up in Southern California, and I had no idea what the Erie Canal meant. I learned about it in US history books and all that kind of stuff when I was in grade school, but it was just this foreign concept. 18 years ago, I moved to Clinton, New York with my family, and we started up teaching at Hamilton College. And all of a sudden, I started passing across these roads with signs that said entering the Erie Canal corridor or something like that, right? The Erie Canal way. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is the Erie Canal that I've always heard about with Sal and the mule and all that kind of stuff. And I like, oh, this is an actual physical place, right? This is it's not just a history book thing or a theoretical thing. It's an actual physical thing that cut through New York State. And it just sort of became kind of fascinating to me as I began to live here and cross across this corridor over time. I was trained as a person in comparative religions, and I came here with that kind of background. So I became really fascinated by the way the Canal Way induced and inaugurated all kinds of different religious traditions. So that's kind of what I'm going to present here today as part of my time. So, okay. If you drive into Palmyra, New York today, you will see a site not unlike what the Mormon founder Joseph Smith saw 200 years ago. A cluster of 4 tall steeples rising from 4 Protestant churches. And you can see them, this is a couple of years ago, but pretty much what you'll see today as you walk there, as you drive in. Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and Episcopalians confront each other at adjacent corners of the town's crossroads. Though they aren't the same steeples as in Smith's day 200 years ago, the interdenominational face-off was already in force, leading Smith to reflect, quote, there was in the place where we lived an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. Priest contended against priest and convert against convert, so that all their good feelings one for another were entirely lost in a strife of words and a contest about opinions. Sounds like a lot of what we understand, many of us, about religions. A lot of strife and contest between them all. In a newly settled land, rife with new religious movements in direct competition for people's souls, Smith turned the discord to his advantage. As is well known through contemporary caricature and acclaim alike, he forged one of the most powerful religious traditions operating in the world today. And the LDS Church and Mormonism as a whole continues to expand across the world 200 years later. What isn't so well known is that the origins of Mormonism, like the origins of many U.S. religious practices and beliefs, are deeply bound up with the birth of the Erie Canal. Palmyra is situated on the canal, 15 miles south of Lake Ontario and 20 miles east of Rochester. Smith's family moved from New England to the Palmyra area in 1817 when Joseph was 12 years old. The same year, the Erie Canal construction began between the towns of Rome and Utica, 100 miles east. By 1823, the Erie Canal was opened between Palmyra and Rochester, establishing the outpost as a regional commercial center. Prosperity grew along with the Euro-American population. In another 2 years, the canal would stretch the entire 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, as probably many of you who are at the Erie Canal Museum know, creating economic boom towns along the way and generating spiritual excitation and experimentation as settlers moved further from the church authorities of the East. In 1827, Smith tells us, he found golden plates with ancient inscriptions on them at the nearby Hill Cumorah, again, not far from the Erie Canal. With the help of close colleagues, he set to translating these into what became the Book of Mormon. Around that time, a printing press was shipped from Palmyra from New York City by canal boat. In 1830, 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon were printed in Egbert Grandin's print shop, located in the heart of the burgeoning canal-fed commercial district of Palmyra, among the various Christian churches. those four churches that we saw at the beginning. This was another kind of space entering into that. Smith's Church of Christ, the Latter-day Saints, officially formed the same year with a small but loyal assembly. Interdenominational dispute followed. Those four steeples didn't really want one more steeple along the way. So it forced Smith and his followers to leave town. In 1831, they packed their belongings in a canal boat and began the trek west, starting with a trip across the Erie Canal to the western lands of Ohio and then further overland to Utah. Catching up with them in Ohio in 1832 was a man named Brigham Young, who had grown up with the canals. Brigham Young painted its boats, its housings, its buildings, and the furniture for the thriving towns along the path. This is an invoice from Young from 1825 for painting lock houses. Probably can't see it quite there, but he was painting lock houses and boats along the way. So both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, the key people at the foundations of the Mormon faith, would have been nothing without the canal. The Mormons, of course, were not the only new religious group of their time directly influenced by the Erie Canal. In A History of American People, the historian Paul Johnson suggested that the Erie Canal is, quote, the outstanding example of a human artifact creating wealth rapidly in the whole of history. I mean, that's a big statement, of course, to make that. But we can rephrase that, and for the purposes of my talk here, I'm going to rephrase that and suggest that, quote, the Erie Canal is the outstanding example of a human artifact creating new religious movements rapidly in the whole of human history. Within 2 decades of its opening, this psychic highway, as it's been called, cultivated extraordinary experimental groups, including the Mormons, the Adventists, Spiritualism, a revived Apocalypticism, utopian communal societies such as the Oneida Community with the Amana Colony and the Shakers passing through, as well as the emotion-laden revivals of the Second Great Awakening. The canal also engendered the religiously infused social movements of abolition, women's rights, and temperance. Little wonder the preacher Charles Finney named this area the burned over district, as many of us understand this area to be. Even so, this moniker belies a deeper truth. Out of the ashes rose a deeply American faith that continues to exist to this present day, for better or for worse. With this, the canal-based religious social movements further aided in the displacement of populations of Haudenosaunee, and the establishment of American religions is, here again, founded on the subjugation of other peoples and traditions. Begun in 1817 and completed in 1825, the Erie Canal stretched from Buffalo, as I probably don't need to rehearse this, but just as a refresher for some of you, it stretched from Buffalo on the edge of the Great Lakes all the way to Albany and the banks of the Hudson, with 83 locks in between. And in so doing, it cut right through the lives and the lands of the Haudenosaunee, and forever disrupted the lives of the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora peoples. The first stretch of the canal went from Rome to Utica, and on the 22nd of October, 1819, the first boat made this journey. In his book, The Pioneers of Utica from 1877, Moses Bagg, one of the sort of founders of Utica, near where I live these days, quoted this. He said, "Seldom has there been more heartfelt joy than was manifested on this occasion, and the feelings of those who viewed the departure from Utica of this, the first boat which the waters of the canal had ever borne, bordered on enthusiasm." And I stress that word enthusiasm because at the time, 200 years ago, we don't think about this so much today, but in the early 19th century, it still retained spiritual meanings as being God-possessed. That's literally the Greek roots of the word enthusiasm, is God within us, God-possessed. God possesses us. That's what enthusiasm is about. And it still retained those theological meanings at that time. So the word enthusiasm was sort of used in interesting kinds of ways around the time. The canal from the start was deeply bound with a theological understanding of this new world. It was one of the greatest civil engineering feats in world history, made all the more amazing since there was little expertise in matters of engineering for such a grand project. From Albany, it was a quick 150 miles by steamboat to New York Harbor, and this aquatic connection is what turned New York into a world-class city. Timber, salt, grain, and goods came from Western New York to expand the lively seaport of New York City. And New York City's population increased between 1820 to 1860. It increased 700% during that time, as markets for New York City's goods opened up in western regions of the continent as well as Europe. So New York City basically was built, I would suggest, on the Erie Canal, as some of you probably have seen in various kinds of ways. The Erie Canal follows the only significant gap in the Appalachian mountain chain extending from Maine to Georgia, a geographical fact attributed by George Washington and his contemporaries to the goodness of Providence. This navigable break, this narrow strip of land in a vast country, was God's gift to the fledgling nation, inspiring citizens to move west, push the frontier, and glean benefits from the natural riches of the continental interior. Intellectual ideas about manifest destiny flowed from the geographical realities of this place. Ideology is nothing without technology and geography. And it is not incidental that the Indian Removal Act was established in 1830 as the westering effects of the Erie Canal came to fruition. The Indian Removal Act was a United States law that authorized the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi to Native American tribes in exchange for their ancestral lands within existing state borders. This act was signed by President Jackson, led to the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans, most notably during the Trail of Tears. That's why I live on Oneida land, not far from here, and why there are Oneida in, say, Wisconsin right now, and why people were displaced and forced to move increasingly west. Even if the Euro-American Christian theology combined politics and religion into ideas like manifest destiny, this divine gift needed improvements, as nature did not offer an immediately accessible ride. Too many portages and navigations of rapids challenged human and commercial transport. With the Erie Canal and its ingenious set of locks came the ability to travel from New York City all the way to Cleveland with unheard of ease. When canal construction commenced under the inflammable work of New York Governor DeWitt Clinton with the state funding, as you might know, President Jefferson at the time vetoed federal funding, so it went to a statewide thing. The waterway exceeded its basic geographical and transportation use to become an empire builder. Indeed, New York became known as the Empire State around this time. Meanwhile, the political economic empire was inextricable from a spiritual empire. A land given by God comes with a serious set of responsibilities. Many European settlers, steeped in religious and Christian, specifically traditions, saw the growing American continent not only as a new Eden, a place to start over, but also as a new Jerusalem, a place that marks the end of the coming of the kingdom of God. Which also meant that the end of the world was soon to come and there was work to be done to prepare. It's a different apocalypticism that seems to be going on these days, where it's just sort of fear and fret and everything. 200 years ago, the end of the world meant you need to get your stuff together and figure out what to do and get it right in the world. That was the idea of apocalypticism. That's why the end of the world was coming, because we messed up somehow. We need to get it right. Today, we're just sort of feel like there's much more of a passive, sorry, that's my sermon for the day. Well, that's much more of a passive singing around, oh no, the end of the world is coming, blah, blah, blah. Back in the day, it meant we had to do things to get ready for the kingdom of God, right? We needed to prepare for that. That's a sort of, not much in the Christian tradition these days, but part of what I like about that is that the apocalypse means you need to get things right, get your life in order, get your house in order, get things together. Jesus is not going to be happy if he comes back and sees us doing some of the things we're doing these days. So that's kind of a side note for that, but this is the understanding of the time and place at the time. We needed to do work to bring on the kingdom of God. We wanted the kingdom of God. It meant all kinds of wonderful things. So we needed to work on this. So at the same time, freed from the shackles of church authorities that dominated both Old England and New England, this land along the canal provided ample imaginative possibilities for working out one's salvation, ushering in the coming millennium, the reign of God's kingdom on earth. Apocalyptic fever ensued, setting up a series of self-styled prophets who believed themselves to be voices crying in the wilderness, like Jeremiah or St. John before them. Joseph Smith was one. And this is the reason the Mormons are called the Latter-day Saints, right? In other words, this is the latter days, this is the end of times. Others, like John Humphrey Noyes, responded by creating a utopian Christian community on the principle of biblical communism, meaning that all things were shared equally among members, including children and spouses. This was obviously fairly controversial. The Noyes-led Oneida Community was established in 1848 in the central region of the Canalway with a special building that hosted up to 300 members. You can see a glimpse of it there on the right. A communal child care facility and carefully delineated system of sexual partnering made this an unusual arrangement. And Noyes himself coined the term free love more than a century before the hippies. The Oneida Community's metalworking skills sustained them, and even after their community life faded, their well-known silverware has continued to grace tables around the world. And probably many of you have heard of their silverware and know of the Oneida Silverware Company. But of course, they also made bear traps. They also made various traps, and you can see that closely. The trap here is created by the Oneida Community as well. Noyes and Smith were careful not to be too specific about the coming into the world. Others, not so much. Around the same time, up the Champlain Canal, connecting up to Lake Champlain, a wheat farmer turned a Baptist minister named William Miller predicted the second coming of Jesus to occur on March 21st, 1843, based on his extensive study of the numerology of the Bible. When the end did not come, he revised his calculations. I got some math wrong, right? Messed up in second grade. For October 22nd, 1844. The failed prediction led to what would become known as the Great Disappointment. I love this term for a historical kind of thing, the Great Disappointment. Many of Miller's numerous followers lost faith, as one would at this time, at least in the cause, but they turned to others like the Shakers and other rapidly growing Christian sects for connections. Others like Ellen G. White took up where Miller left off, and the Adventist tradition was born through an Albany-based meeting in 1845. The Adventist sects that followed from this meeting were based on, among other things, healthy bodies and an understanding of Jesus's imminent return. In other words, the Advent. That's what Advent means, the return. Some of their followers went on to Battle Creek, Michigan, to found the famed sanatorium there. And just a note, the Adventists are one of the fastest growing traditions in the Southern Hemisphere today, in the 21st century. Continues on 200 years later. With freedom comes responsibility. So prophets and preachers, teachers and Advent activists endeavored to create a more equitable world in the here and now, inspiring each other in socio-religious work. The Canalway of the 19th century was where former slaves and outspoken abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth mingled with women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in Rochester, Seneca Falls, and elsewhere, as they all sought to articulate social applications for the religious roots of freedom and equality. Over in Syracuse, not far from here, of course, Stanton's and Anthony's colleague, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, is one of those focal points that shows the social interconnections that the Canal Way created. She was the author of Women, Church, and State, an exceptional historian, and who also became the mother-in-law of Frank Baum, author of the great American utopian mythology, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Stanton was the cousin of Utica native and Christian reformer Gerrit Smith, who funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, promoted the Underground Railroad along the Erie Canal, and worked alongside Frederick Douglass in publishing anti-slavery newspapers in Syracuse and Rochester. Gage grew restless with the patriarchy of the Christian church, though sought to reform it. She didn't see the Bible as the problem, but rather the patriarchal interpretations of it. Ultimately, she turned to the customs of the Haudenosaunee, finding a strikingly different approach to gender relations. Instead of being primitive, quote, as so many of her time suggested, Haudenosaunee women could own property, vote on issues, hold political positions, and while only a male could lead, the leaders were nominated by women. Enamored by their traditions, she was adopted into the Wolf Clan and given the name She Who Holds the Sky. Side note, so much of my understanding of Gage comes from the decades of work by Sally Roche Wagner, and I really appreciate her work. I was so sad to hear of her recent death. She used to come to my classes at Hamilton. My students were always just amazed at her enthusiasm for her subject matter. So I just want to sideline Dr. Wagner's work over the years. Smith, Douglass, Gage, and Stanton were but a few of the many who realized how print media could become vital to the spread of religious fervor and social reform, and the Canal Way created notable new publishing venues that codified much of the early republic. Perhaps the most important preacher of the 19th century, Charles Finney, sparked revivals in canal cities as part of the Second Great Awakening. He traveled on canal boats from town to town, preaching along the way. The Utica revival, for instance, nearby where I live, began in 1826, and it was so heated, according to reports, that its fires never burned down until about 1829. During which time there are estimates of 3,000 conversions, while the city of Utica's 1830 census indicates a little over 8,000 people live there. Right? That's an interesting mathematical dimension going on there. But make no mistake, this was not just a preacher ascending the stage to speak. Well, people became so overwhelmed by the message that they changed their lives on the spot. This is an image from around the same time, but taking place down in Cane Ridge, Tennessee, kind of one of the more better known images from the Second Great Awakening in Cane Ridge, Tennessee, in the southern part of this. There was sort of a northern dimension of the Second Great Awakening in the southern part. This image might reveal that people were sort of overwhelmed and they're sort of fainting and having various experiences, bodily experiences along the way. I want to suggest that it wasn't quite so simple as someone just standing up and preaching. So let me just say, instead, people were primed for conversion by the many religious newspapers and tracts that began at this time and were dispersed by the way of the canal boats. Indeed, William Miller's end of times predictions, we just saw, predicting the end of the world in 1843 and 1844, they would have remained nothing but the rants of a local preacher were it not for the publishing work of Joshua von Himes. Himes was the publisher for Miller's ideas and tracts. He was the media guru for him at the time. Over 5 million Millerite tracts and papers are estimated to have been distributed across the country just in the 1840s alone. Print media became vital to the spread of religious fervor and social reform. At the same time, in 1825, the Christian publishers of the American Tract Society started up in New York City, quickly becoming one of the largest print distributors in the United States, due in part to the market that was opened up by the canal. The Baptist General Tract Society operated out of Utica and Rochester, printing thousands of papers, pamphlets, and tracts. And just a year before Finney's massive revival in Rochester, a few miles down the canal, as I've mentioned before, Joseph Smith had 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon printed in Palmyra, a number that far exceeded literate souls in that town. Had it been 5 years earlier, the transfer of a 1,500-pound iron printing press from New York City to Grandin's print shop in Palmyra would have been nearly impossible. But now the canal allowed for an unheard of ease in commercial transportation. All of these activities led to a rapid rise in literacy rates in the young nation, which in turn created demand for more printed material, which various religious organizations gleefully helped supply, aided by efficient transportation across the canal. The commercial marketplace was also a spiritual marketplace, and it was technology and not theology primarily that prompted changes. Theology built on the technology that was there. With literacy and publishing on the rise and an influx of new immigrants, the Erie Canal generated a symbiotic relation between the arts, education, and religious sensibilities. The European writers Alexis Tocqueville and Harriet Martineau traveled the same canal boats. They went up and down right outside here, right 200 years ago. They were traveling up and down in these canal boats that American writers Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville did. Melville, we know for Moby Dick and the great sort of whaling things, but he came to understand water through the Erie Canal, right? He traveled up and down the Hudson, he traveled up and down the Erie Canal, and that sort of began to, as I understand his biography, this is part of what gave him this understanding of water and change of water into spaces, and then he extended it out, of course, into the Atlantic. They all came to different conclusions about the young republic and its religiosity. If you've read Martineau's accounts from the Erie Canal, she was bitter and grumpy the whole time. She's coming from the UK, just thinks this is awful. Tocqueville's kind of amazed by this space and how it cuts through the wilderness. Hawthorne and Melville have different ideas about what wilderness means. And again, it's very much based on, there's this, I don't have time to go into this here, but it's very much based on the idea that this was wilderness. Even though the Haudenosaunee had been here for centuries and centuries and centuries, the people who came through sort of saw this as wilderness because they couldn't find their way. Hawthorne's got a great story of when he stepped off a canal boat at one point and he went off into the woods just 100 meters up the way, and he just got confused and overwhelmed by this dense forest, and just this was this kind of wilderness experience to him. So this idea of wilderness, and again, I don't have time for this here, but the idea of wilderness is really critical to this understanding. They call this wilderness, call it somehow primitive, and allows you to take control of an area that has already been inhabited by peoples for hundreds of years before this. With literacy, okay, so and then just sort of along this line too, Hudson River painters, Thomas Cole, as many of you probably know, Asher Durand, found their inspiration not just, right, they call them the Hudson River School people, but they also went up and down the canalway, right? And they found this idea of, again, the wilderness to be an interesting kind of place. You could sit on your boat, you could pass through the wilderness without actually having to go into it, without actually having to be in there. It provided kind of a, as long as you ducked your head in between the bridges, you could experience the wilderness along the way. In educational circles, with the engineering success of the Erie Canal in mind, Amos Eaton founded one of the first universities of science and technology in the English-speaking world, the Rensselaer School outside Albany. And from there, Eaton established a traveling summer science school along the canal. Further up the canalway, Elizabeth Cady was taking classes at the Troy Female Seminary. Troy Seminary was founded by Emma Willard in what she saw to be Christian values, and thus became the first school to teach mathematics and science to women. Well before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were learning at the Presbyterian-founded Oneida Institute over in Whitesboro, and the Free Baptists founded the coeducationally, racially integrated New York Central College in McGrawville, New York. Gerrit Smith was an initial major benefactor to that college, which also became the place where Charles Reason became the first African-American college professor in the country. Denominationally minded continuing education turned ecumenical in the far western reaches of the canalway at Chautauqua, sparking a movement of Chautauquas that stretched across the country by the early 20th century. At the far east of the canal, at the same time, a penniless Irish immigrant named William James settled in Albany early in the century, made a fortune on canal-based real estate, and passed it on to his descendants, who included the Harvard philosopher and psychologist William James and the writers Alice and Henry James. The younger William James, in turn, became intrigued by spiritualism, a movement that grew from the supernatural accounts of the Fox sisters communing with the dead in their house near Rochester in 1848. From there, spiritualism became a global phenomenon that is very present in the contemporary day. Railroads and telegraphs up there. When railroad and telegraph lines were established in the middle of the 19th century, the canal's singular influence began to decline. However, some of these new lines followed the routes of the canal and fed off what were deeply established urban areas by then. Canal towns like Utica, Syracuse, and Rochester became rail towns, and what were new spiritual experiments became part of the establishment, primed and ready for export. And this postcard, I think it's early 20th century, from kind of Johari, and you see the canal, and then you see the rail lines, and then you see the telegraph lines, all on the same kind of parallel kind of space. This didn't happen, of course, every point of the Erie Canal, but the fact that these sort of communication and transportation pathways happened along the same places, I think, is really significant, that you see them all together in the same basic route. Again, I'm trying to make an argument for geography is integral to all these new experiments. The religious practices, behaviors, and beliefs that emerged in the second quarter of the 19th century in the canalway continued their influence into the western country. As the railroad and telegraph extended far into the American continent, they brought many of the innovative religious practices from the Erie Canal corridor into the new settlements. The Erie Canal became not only a great feat of civil engineering, but of civil communications. Like the Silk Road in Asia, the Incense Trail in Arabia, and the Panama Canal in the Americas, the Erie Canal established physical links across geographic regions, while actively reforming the social environments that spread out beyond the immediate transportation paths. New York's network of canals and cities, rivers, and farmlands made the world smaller and more easily accessible than ever before. Newspapers and immigrants, novelists and painters, grain and lumber, suffragists and freeing slaves, revivalists and new technologies all traveled and lived on the canalway together, creating new connections and establishing unique currents of American religious life. This generated, in the words of Joseph Smith, an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. Thank you so much. Time for questions? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, There was one slide, there was a lot going on and I didn't get the whole gist.
Yeah.
It's the one with William and Henry James and the Chautauqua Institute, which you never really said anything about. And then the woman, and I can't help her.
That's Alice James, yeah, the sister of William and Henry, great novelist in her own right, but for patriarchal reasons was not as noticed as the other two.
But you didn't really mention anything about the Chautauqua Institute, which is a
Yeah.
fascinating place, but I didn't realize it was connected to spiritualism.
Well, it's connected, to my mind, it's sort of a longer kind of talk for this, but yeah, so Chautauqua and the relations of Chautauqua to the Erie Canal, it's kind of on the, as the things are moving increasingly west,
It's really on Erie.
right, and this sort of becomes the place where I feel like I need to develop this
Okay.
part of my argument more, but I think it's a central location for all these emergent religious traditions that are coming together, and it becomes this kind of ecumenical place where, it's sort of a more it's ultimately it's a Christian based
Yes, it is.
environment,
Can I say
right?
something?
But it's,
I've been to Lilydale and
Yeah.
they say it's a spiritual vortex.
yeah,
In that whole region. They're not really
Exactly.
connected other than.
and Lilydale I did not mention here, but similar kind of things. I feel like as it's sort of coming through the Erie Canal, places like Lilydale and Chautauqua on the far western areas are sort of beginning to culminate some of these religious excitements and these religious ideas. And I need to go into more detail of that, but I think it's kind of an interesting thing that happens, right? And both you think about the time and the place of it. It's Western, it's later 19th century. And then of course, places like Chautauqua, I've been to the Chautauqua in Colorado and, there's Chautauquas all over the country that were developed and it pushes these out further west. So I think these ideas germinated in the canal, sort of places like Chautauqua and Lilydale sort of culminated these things and then they sort of went western. It's sort of what I'm playing with, the idea, but I don't have the time now or the resources to, but
Did the Fox sisters, were they at Lilydale or Rochester?
well, they lived, what's that?
Sure.
So, close by Rochester.
It's a neighborhood.
Yeah, it's in the neighborhood, right? So what I'm trying to sort of suggest is it's not just like, they, I don't know, whatever, travel in the Erie Canal, but it's sort of like this kind of spiritual excitement sort of created the possibility for these two sisters to have this, and they later retold their story, right? And how this started. But nonetheless, it sparked a huge religious movement, and it was bound up with, there were certain theologians who sort of articulated why the Fox sisters had done this and this kind of thing. But it's all part of that spiritual excitement that's going along, and it becomes possible because of the Erie Canal. As part of what I'm suggesting is that the Fox sisters, if they were in, Iowa City, Iowa at the time, we wouldn't know what spiritualism is today, right? But because it was there at this time, it sparked something new. That's part of what I'm trying to suggest. Hope that makes sense. Yeah, I've been.
I love it. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. One of the phrases that you used there, which I think is so important to think about, is theology building on technology. And quickly today of the artificial intelligence. Moving into as near and what's going to develop in our theology. And I know for Leo the 14th, that's prime concern.
Yeah, right.
We think about, I know he's already called a big conference on that.
Yeah.
And then I'm just thinking of the whole aspect of the canal, when it's on the psychic highway, but also just as you said, the technology involved, and that allowed for a broadening of thought in ways that we don't even know how to consider.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks so much. So the question about technology spurring theology, and this is sort of something that I've spent much of my life researching, is the sort of relation between these two things and how media communications. Everything from, there is no such thing as Protestant Christianity without a printing press, right? It just doesn't make sense to centralize the Bible at a certain point in history when it wasn't necessarily central up until the 1500s. But you needed a printing press. You needed to have a way to have a printed document in the hands of multiple people, right? The masses. So mass media affects the way religions operate. And so I think this is one sort of maybe smaller example of that, but I think that's, a very, very important point is that the technologies of the space create the theologies. We tend to think we're dualists. I feel like we're still dualists in the 21st century. We think I'm going to think something and my body is going to follow it. But I'm getting a little more skeptical of those kinds of things. I feel like my body is telling my mind what to do, right? My body is saying, yeah, you've had enough. Just sit down for a while, right? Just do this. And I think that's true throughout religious history. I learned Christian history by reading about a bunch of theologians, right? A bunch of basically men in a European Mediterranean setting who wrote about things. And then all the other stuff, the arts and everything flowed from that. But the more you kind of get into the nitty gritty of it, you realize the theologians were already being influenced by where they lived, what paintings they were seeing, what kind of technology they were involved in, what kind of media they were exposed to, and these kinds of things. I think it's much more of a cyclical kind of back and forth, so this is kind of my approach to comparative religions in general, but trying to sort of think about this in terms of the Erie Canal, that in Christian theology, we tend to hold up Charles Finney, right, as the second great awakening and this great preacher. And then, and he certainly was important. I'm not denying the importance of Charles Finney, but the only way he could have made the arguments, especially about free will, as opposed to the older, more deterministic, like God knows what's going to go on and this is just going to happen. This idea of free will really comes back importantly in the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century in the United States. Charles Finney is really key on it. And I believe this gets me into sort of a neoliberal argument of sorts, but it was the socioeconomic environment that enabled these kinds of arguments to sort of say, so I've written on someone like Austin Stewart, who was, freed himself of slavery, ended up in Rochester, opened up a shop in Main Street in Rochester, and, struggled through his life, but was just sort of this classic self-made person, right, in the United States. His whole ability to become a freed slave from the South who's come to the North, set up a market, been able to be a successful business person, a teacher of Sunday school and things like this, were because of this kind of socioeconomic environment that he was created. Rochester, Syracuse, they created spaces that were antithetical to the Southern enslaved labor economy, right, at the time, the 18th century or the 19th century. So this kind of socioeconomic structure was the challenge, right? That's why New York could become, we could have abolition in New York State in the late 1828 and still have it not be in place for decades, right? In the South, is because we in New York, I'm not saying we, I haven't been here that long, I shouldn't say that. New Yorkers back in the day were able to challenge the Southern enslaved labor economy and sort of say, hey, look, we can have freed slaves, we can have white people, we can have others, running the shops and do this, and we could get by. And that, I think, produces a powerful understanding of your own theology, right? I mean, I think that really changes the theology. So I don't want to disparage the theologians, but I think that's a lot more complicated between what theologians are doing and this kind of intellectualist environment and what is actually happening on the ground. And I think there's a back and forth between that. I hope that, sorry, I didn't mean to get too complicated, but I hope that makes sense. Thanks for it.
So I wrote an undergraduate thesis about 50 years ago on the Second Great Awakening, Middletown, Connecticut.
Oh, yeah.
Where the church and the state were one, and then in 1790 and 1830, all these new denominations popped up to break away from the church. It was almost like revolutionary to break the state kind of down. But it didn't ever rev up like it did coming across the Erie Canal. So your thoughts are, I mean, the Second Great Awakening was happening in New England.
Right.
What it was, your thoughts are, the huge movement of people to the Erie Canal that revved it up?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why is the sort of say Connecticut-based Second Great Awakening different than, say Rochester's or something in central western New York? I think that it just simply, as you probably know, 1820, this is the Wild Wild West. We're living, right here and now was the Wild Wild West. That's a problematic statement, but sort of use that for now. It was a place where there were no institutional structures, right? But Connecticut by that time, right, had already, I mean, it's already New England. It's already, right, they're established estates. They've got the church that's coming over from Europe, and there's already these interrelated dimensions of the official churches in Europe who have been transplanted into, again, New England, and this sort of space. But once you start moving, into the Appalachians and, west of the Appalachians, right, this is wow, everything's wide open. So I think geographically, a lot of things started to change. The church leaders couldn't really keep up with the westward expansion of this socioeconomic movement, right? That just created, Syracuse and Rochester become these, boom towns, right? Became some of the richest cities in the world, right?
Like the lack of social rigidity.
Yeah.
Connecticut or whatever.
Yeah, right. Connecticut's already kind of settled, right? And they've got their sort of spaces and they've already got their institutions, right? It's been some time since I've been there, but to kind of break through into, again, I geographically just sort of, once you get sort of on the western edge of the Appalachians, right? I mean, it becomes open land, right? In the mindset of the Euro Americans at this time. So I think that raises some really interesting issues of why that becomes different. And again, I think it's also, there's try to mention briefly, there's a mixture of print media at the same time, right? So 1820s, Charles Finney is going up and down the canalway with his preaching, but he's also, they're printing flyers and they're sending them out. Charles Finney's coming to Utica, next month. Please come and join. Charles Finney's revivals are impossible without a print. You all needed to know this was happening today to show up in this place, right? So we do it through the internet, right? You find it on Facebook or newsletters or something like that. Same thing happened with Charles Finney. It wasn't like he just showed up downtown and started preaching, right? They had flyers ahead of time posted. You needed the print media, you needed that transportation ability to sort of say this is happening up and down the place. And the canalway, and actually, in certain kind of retrospects, it becomes a very narrow slice of New York, or what we call New York today, right? I mean, it's just, you go off too far, there's a couple of canalway, and there's an interesting intersected canalway with the Chenango Canal and different, the Champlain Canal. But it also is fairly narrow going through, and so it creates this information superhighway, as it were, at the time. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah.
I think to add on as well, especially in reading individuals, I feel like we ignore individuals in history. You have to think about people who moved here or people who are more open to different ideas and perspectives, and are also here to make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
I think that also shows more individual willingness to explore different theological.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, the individual kind of movement to this space, and so the examples of people like in the LDS tradition, the Mormon tradition, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young are both from Vermont, right? And they come here. A number of farming things go bad in Vermont. There's some bad, weather going on during that time. Their families end up moving here, and as I started this, right, Joseph Smith comes here, and as a young teenager, basically, he's moving to Palmyra outside of Rochester, and he's seeing all this sort of all this different religious, what he calls religious excitement going on at the time. And he's like, oh, something different's got to be done, right, to get through all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's really important to think about. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just gonna say too, it's interesting how this gives rise to the whole free thought movement, Robert Greene, Ingersoll, and the pendulum swings the other way.
Yes, right. Yeah, so I think it is a space for free thought, but again, I want to sort of stress that the free thought is dependent on your socioeconomic circumstances, right? Free thought doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's what we, I want to kind of question that idea of free, a little bit. It's an important idea. I want to hold on to it, but it's also kind of an ideal, and our freedom is always constrained by our socio-political, religious, economic circumstances. So what we think is freedom is usually a lot more confined than we think it is. So I want to kind of bring that back. And so part of the point of this too is sort of saying ideas come from geographical, technological, socioeconomic realities, and our thoughts are free within certain parameters, but not. Freedom doesn't mean, nothing left to lose. Freedom, means we're constrained, right? Freedom is always constrained. So I'm trying to sort of point out, and I feel like pointing out some of those constraints help us in the here and now, maybe, to think about, okay, I want to be a free thinker, but what am I bound by? How far can I go? And I think it's kind of an important thing to play into this. Not to deny that, just
Ingersoll went pretty far.
yeah. That's good. Yeah.
This is very interesting. I never really thought about the religions and the canal coming together. And I do see from the economic thing and the social thing, a very parallel to Route 40, the national road, where it went through because my parents grew up on here, where that went through West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio. What came along with it, what I heard growing up in Buffalo, what came along with the canal, lots of prostitution, lots of
Yes.
stealing, lots of strangers rolling down one night looking for a good time.
Absolutely.
So how does that relate to these religious peoples, and was there any attempt to like evangelize or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I
Is
think,
that
yeah.
something we can show as an example of this is sin?
It's the same, right? all the sin and debauchery along the canalway. Yes, and there's plenty of examples, right? You go downstairs and you see people were, paid in whiskey bottles and, so much things.
Right
So I
here
mean,
in
I
the
think,
city.
what's
Right
that?
here in the city.
Yeah, right. And I think part of it was, the rise of, so there were three great social movements, right? One was the abolition of slavery, one was women's suffrage, right, to vote, and the other one was temperance, right, to get rid of alcohol, right? These were the three big, and they were all combined with each other, right? So the women's rights groups were also teetotalers, right? And there were all these kind of like these different factions coming together, and oftentimes I think with Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, they were kind of on the same page, but others were, there was all kinds of controversy between these social reform groups. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was, actually broke from the mainstream women's suffrage group, right, by the late 19th century, because she's like, okay, you've gone too far Christian. Like some of them said, we want not just women's suffrage, but we want a Christian nation, right, decidedly. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage said, no, we're not gonna, I don't want to do that. There's other things to be. So so I think a lot of that comes down to, yes, I think there was it helped a lot of the religious groups to moralize, as religious groups tend to do, right? You shouldn't be drinking so much. You shouldn't be going with the sex workers, right? These things, maybe are not a good thing. So there was a fair amount of that going on. I think that, at times, of course, that gives rise to a certain, enthusiasm among religious people to sort of think, Yeah, we're better than that, right? We're more than, but yeah, that's really important, I think, to it all, as well. And to sort of see the corruption, I was talking to Derek a little bit, beforehand, sort of delving into some of the, corruption that's going on, all along the way, right? It's not like this was just like, oh, everything was wonderful and, we tend to gloss over everything. Oh, New York State did it on bonds, cost $6-7 million. They paid it off in a few years. It was on time, blah, 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 right? It's a great project, right? Theoretically, yes, if you just gloss over it all, but underneath it all, right? Of course, of the exploitative labor dimensions, the use of sex workers, the use of alcohol, along the way, and I think that sort of helped the religious groups along the way as well to sort of come back and sort of say, see, if you just followed our way, you wouldn't have these problems, right? Here's the malaria you're getting from, being in the, out in the, trying to drain these, areas and Montezuma and areas like that. So yeah, Sandy, hi.
Yeah, you talked about the religious or constraints around freedom.
Yeah.
And 100 years prior, early 18th century, there were great orators that were indigenous to these lands, traveling to Europe and speaking about a different way of living. Had a whole different set of values.
Right.
And they were critiquing the early Enlightenment thinkers over there, particularly in France, about freedom, particularly. And that this concept of freedom in Europe had all these limitations that you were, just expressing. And the only way they could envision freedom was under the rule of their monarchs or the systems of churches. So this is 100 years prior to the Erie Canal. So there were such lost opportunities. Obviously, it's threatening to the development of settling this continent. So there was a real strong hold in silence and this voice. But it affected legislation. I think
one of the things I was fascinated by in your dynamic between technology and theology is that I often think of technology being informed by theology and the other way around.
Right.
Because, for example, a Haudenosaunee will never seem to, no, I'm that would be part of this.
Yeah.
So it seems like the canal itself becomes an theological fascination project, right?
Yeah. That's a good phrase. The theological fascination project.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's a great phrase to kind of recapture that. Yeah, and it's I mean part of what Sandy expresses. I think this. I mean, obviously, freedom is not a new term. It's not arguably, I'm not sure who it's invented by, if we can say there's such a thing as invention, but these conversations have been going on, for well before the Erie Canal, and yes, indigenous folks, the Haudenosaunee and others are going to Europe at well before the Erie Canal and sort of arguing for freedom and in different kinds of ways.
Freedom was really understood to be this engagement.
Yes.
Connecting
Yes.
with regenerative energy.
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
Humans exchange, the
Yeah.
natural world exchanges, the waters and air exchanges.
Yeah.
So that was, it's a different understanding.
It's a different understanding. Absolutely. No, and I think that's important. I always learn it sort of philosophically is there's freedom from, and then there's freedom to. And freedom from is kind of the libertarian argument. I just don't want anybody to tell me what to do, and I just don't have any structures. Freedom to is actually taking responsibility for what you have and working within that. And that's freedom I personally want to work for. And I think that's part of what you're sort of expressing too. It's relational, right? Freedom is always relational. It doesn't mean, freedom from usually tends to be irrelational. It's like, I don't want anybody in my life. I want to just be left alone. Freedom to means I am in relation. I'm in partnership with the earth, with other people, with societal, structures and things like that. Figuring out what I can do within that. And I think that's what I do as an educator, trying to push away from the freedom from and push toward the freedom too. And I, and I'm eliding all those specificities of, indigenous people going to Europe and sort of expressing this, which is not my area of specialty, but no, I think that's an important point. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Sandy. Yeah.
I was wondering, to what extent do you think American religious traditions have been shaped by interactions with Native people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish the person to ask is right over here, this Phil Arnold. What are the relations of, how has US religious traditions been affected by Native peoples, in various ways, and how does that gone back and forth? I'm just going to say I'm not the expert in this, and Phil Arnold is the in the religion department over at SU, and probably knows sort of as an intellectual academic more than most people on this planet about that interrelation. I mean, just as a softball sort of kind of thing. There's always interrelations. There's no way Christianity is not involved with it. I think people like Matilda Jocelyn Gage I think are fascinating kind of people to sort of explore. I'm not saying she was right about everything, but explored that interaction, right? Sort of grew up in a Christian environment, in a very progressive Christian environment, according to, go to our house museum down the road here, not far from here. Fascinating place. We're in Fayetteville, right? And a great place. I continued, again, Sally Rush Wagner, really influential in my own thinking about her, sort of talked about her relationship with Christianity. And as far as I kind of get it, it was, again, I think I mentioned this in my notes, but she didn't really reject the Bible so much as a certain interpretation of the Bible, right? And that was really the problem that was going on, these kind of patriarchal interpretations of it. So I think people like her are really important to look at, right? And sort of sometimes forgotten. Maybe in Syracuse we know about her a little bit more, but she gets a little more elided. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton are these are the women's rights suffragists who we really want to hold up in the 19th century. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage got a little bit forgotten over the years, and probably if it weren't for the work of Sally Wagner, we would not really know much about her at all today. But I think that's an interesting kind of dynamic of the way these things happen. I think you'll find this across, whether you're in the current state of Iowa or the current state of California, you're going to find all kinds of ways that Christianity is also not just a monolithic thing, right? It's been going on for a couple thousand years. There's a couple billion people who have, so not everybody really thinks the same in Christianity. Many people in Christianity have been deeply influenced by other forms of being in the world and other values in the world. And I think they're oftentimes deeply influenced by whatever the local community has sort of produced for them, right? If we go to, spend time in Puerto Rico for various reasons, and the Christianity that's going on there is certainly different than the Christianity that I grew up with in California, right? And these are not, hard to even say these are the same things. Maybe they meet on Sunday at 11 o'clock in the morning. That's about the only thing you could say, right? But then once that, it starts to look really different from each other. So I'm really interested in that kind of ways that religious movements move, and the same is true for Buddhism or Judaism or Hinduism as well. It's just they're always sort of inflecting the local environments that are going on. But for deeper analysis, Dr. Phil Arnold over here.
This is your show, but
tell us something.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I've recently heard that Joseph Smith was very intimately involved with the Haudenosaunee there, just east of Rochester. That was just a stimulating hint that somebody suggested to me recently. And I wondered if you knew anything about that.
I know nothing about that. It sounds fascinating.
It does.
Yeah.
Because Native Americans show up in the Book of Mormon in some central ways.
Yeah, right,
You know,
right.
Even the Haudenosaunee in some ways. So.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he was fascinated, I think, with a lot
Oh,
of what
totally.
was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to go out to the Palmyra, to the big pageant they do
Yeah.
every summer, and if you've been there and sort of seen some of that stage presentation, some of the markings, I mean, it's sort of this kind of quasi Aztec Maya
Yeah.
kind of, it's this kind of weird hybrid, mashup of things, but it's really interesting the way it borrows these, at least to my mind, sort of as a visual kind of thinker, think about them as very sort of Central American and
Right.
Mesoamerican.
I mean, that's part of they're included, the indigenous people are
Yeah.
included in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
As, the lost tribe of
Right.
Israel or something,
Yeah.
But
or
that
Lamanites.
wasn't
really
pronounced in the
wild
last pageant, the
Yeah.
Aztec kind of diminished.
Oh, yeah.
It was very much
Oh, totally.
central
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah,
They
totally.
don't have those pageants.
Yeah, right, yeah, but fascinating kind of engagements there. I think, I'm trying to remember, who's been researching some of this, David Bolingbrook, researching some of this, sort of the roots of, the relations, the roots of the LDS church in this area here, and the effect of
Who's
the Erie
that?
Canal. David Bolingbrook.
Yeah.
Yeah, his name, I'll give you his name later. It's around some,
I just remember a time when I was there, of course, the flag, American flag is,
Oh, yeah.
it goes down, the pageant happens, and at the end of it, this little boy said, Daddy, when they take Jesus off the cross, are they gonna put the flag back up?
Oh, my goodness, so many dimensions that opens up. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what is pageant? I'm.
Oh.
Mormons have a pageant in Colorado?
Yeah, they did. It ended about 4 years ago. They put it up. It was like, they did it for a good 75 years. It was basically a reenactment, a big, it's on Hill Cumorah, right outside in between Manchester and Palmyra, New York. And, literally tens of thousands of people a year would come out to it. They would set up a big outside stadium. The stage sort of went up the Hill Cumorah, and it was a reenactment of the Book of Mormon, more or less. Not the Broadway play. That's a very, very different thing than this. But they did their own what they call it, a pageant, and pyrotechnics, waterworks. 600 people would be involved with this play over a several-week period, and really just an amazing kind of time. I spent a lot of time over the summers researching that and talking with, interviewing people who were there. And so anyway, but they, for a number of reasons, they've shut down now, and it's an interesting kind of, after effect. Well, thank you all so much for your time and questions. I appreciate your